continuous improvement programme, and we discussed and introduced the toolkit, but the idea was it was a standalone resource. It didn't need to be phoning people to understand how to use it. So there's information on the tabs along the bottom explaining how to use it, including here, repeating what I've just told you, which is we direct schools towards those first two toolkits before looking at our own. And then the toolkit was designed, as I mentioned, to be short, easy to complete, and we wanted to help schools really to reflect on, as we've said here, the impacts of their school improvement work, and thinking about impacts in terms of those three groups that I mentioned earlier: impacts on staff, at the school level, and on pupils. We wanted a way of actually being able to collect different types of evidence to demonstrate those impacts, and again, I had one slide on that, which we touched on briefly already. It's a way of actually encouraging teachers and schools to think about the quality and strength of the impact of the evidence you're actually collecting as well, which I think is helpful. But ultimately, the purpose of doing this is to help schools think about what is working well and what further actions they could take to improve the effectiveness of their school improvement work. So, can you see, it's probably not very clear. What happens is, as part of this particular programme, and I'm showing you this because it's tied to a specific programme, but it could easily be adapted and used more widely. Okay, schools have to put together a partnership plan. So the high performing school and the other school work together at the very beginning of this 18-month period. They sit down and they decide how can they help one another, what are their targets, and they devise a plan. Here, this is a tab here for them to paste in their priorities from that plan. Okay. And now this is where the toolkit works. So they have to submit evidence to I'll try and zoom in on this so you can see it, to the Welsh Government on a termly basis over the 18-month period. And we wanted our toolkit to tie in with that. So they start with, after they put their plans in, that would appear here and cross over through to the Excel file. Okay, so it's sort of self-populating. This is where I think it starts to have some value, this toolkit. So across the top we've got impacts at those three levels. So there's a bank of options here in relation to evidence collective impacts on school staff. So that could be impacts on individuals or small groups of staff. And then we pan across and there's another bank of questions here about impacts on school-wide impacts, okay, which may appear as a result of this improvement work. And at the far end we've got impacts on pupils, okay. So by breaking it down to those three groups, you start to make this process a bit more manageable, I think. Okay, and then what we've done here, it's very simple. We've got three, they can enter up to three different types of evidence sources, okay, around evidence of impacts on school staff, okay. So we've put in some pre-populated options here to get people thinking. We don't want schools to be confined to thinking about this, but it's helpful you've got some pre-populated options. So the options here, if you can read them on the screen, are your perceptions or reflections of any CPD or training that the staff involved may have had, feedback from colleagues, line managers, changes to resource use or deployment, that could include how staff time is used, deployed or support staff, for example, and any grading and or feedback from lesson observations or video. So the idea is, if you have some of that data, you can very simply pick from the drop-down list, you populate these boxes, and if schools were able to enter up to three forms of evidence, I'd be very happy personally. But you can obviously, we've said to schools, please modify this, use it in the way that works with you, so you can add columns, add other evidence sources, or put other forms of evidence in. There's a box here for description. That's just a space for them to put into more detail about what it is they've collected. So we've got some very top level categories there. They can put the detail in of what's been collected in that box. We've then got a box here on rating of impacts on school staff. Okay, so we've got a very simple, we're not trying to do something that's scientifically robust here. The process though is to try and get people to think about evidence can be of different quality, and the work that you're doing can have different types of impact on the school. So here we've simply created a 4-point scale with 0 being no impact, 1 low impact, 2 medium impact, 3 high impact. We deliberately haven't defined what we mean by high, medium or low, so it's open to to interpretation, but it's getting that thinking process happening and getting schools, encouraging schools to engage with the fact that there are different types of evidence and that the improvement work they're doing is having different types of impacts. Okay, then they pan across here to evidence collected on school-wide impacts. And of course it's entirely possible that against those particular targets on the left-hand column, you're not going to be able to populate all of these banks of level of impact depending on the activity. And also I'd expect that as you move across from left to right, and we'll move on to the impacts on pupils in a moment, that is something that takes time. Okay, you know, a lot of this improvement work starts with looking at teaching practice, looking at mechanisms in the school that are there to aid and support the quality of teaching. So a lot of the schools are overhauling their assessment processes, or they're introducing new data management and tracking systems into their schools, so teachers have better quality information about how individual pupils are performing, which in turn can then support them in putting in the individual interventions for those staff, for those pupils. So evidence collected on school-wide impact. So here again, we've got a few more options here to draw on. So we've suggested possible forms of evidence could include feedback from colleagues, changes to school plans, policies, grading and feedback from lesson observations again, other primary evidence, e.g. from action research, surveys, interview data, etc. Increased uptake of target subjects pre or post 16. That's often an objective and a way of measuring success of something. If often, you know, the recent evidence says if young people enjoy a subject and they do well at it, they're more likely to continue with it. Improve pupil progress, achievement, and changes to resource use deployment again there. And then moving across to and again it's the same option description. Put a summary in there about the level of impact they think has happened at that point. And then moving across to the far right then, where we're talking about impacts on pupils, which is often the hardest thing to capture. And we could suggest a range of possible impacts here. So we've got teacher reflection observations. That's probably a starting point there in terms of evidence that's readily available. But what we want to do is encourage schools to move beyond that, ideally. But that's a good starting point. Then you've got progress and attainment data, other primary evidence, external observation. That could be internal, or it could be the inspection body, which in Wales is ESTIN, which I've got there as an option. And again, changes to resource use or deployment. And then at the far right of this, we have two questions. And interestingly, in some of the feedback from the schools we spoke to, I think we had some reservations about these two columns, but I think probably because this is one of the most challenging things to do actually. We're asking two questions here. First is, what is working well about what's been introduced? And the second is, what could be improved and how will this be achieved? So, you know, it's important to do this. The ultimate reason for collecting this evidence is to actually reflect on and review the sort of impact it's having in schools, and not being afraid to change direction or change something else if it's not working. You know, that's what evidence allows you to do. It allows you to review how well something is working and to take some corrective action. It could be about fine-tuning what you're doing or revising what you're doing, or it could be about doing something completely different. But it's important that you build in that evaluation and reflection into the process. And so that's it, essentially. That's it in terms of the toolkit. And schools are encouraged to complete that on a termly basis throughout the duration of the 18-month window in which funding is available to support this school improvement work. And it's, you know, what this is we want schools to use it as a living document. We want schools to be going in there and checking it and reviewing it regularly. And it also acts as a place to store all of that evidence as well, I think. So you know, it's easy to communicate to and have that record of what's been done, how it's been reviewed, what's changed, and you've got the change over time measured as well, because you've got the